Our guest today is in the outer limits of our demographic pool for these. She got her PhD in Chicago in 1983. And these are all, most of our people are right around 1980. So I think you and Jim Farr got his PhD in 82. And the other people got PhDs in the 70s. And then in the spring, as you may know, we're doing the group. It's funny because there's a large cluster of early modernists right around 1980. And then there's another large cluster right around 2000. And so what we thought we would do is in the fall we do the earlier cluster, and in the spring we do the younger cluster. They don't think of themselves as young anymore, but you and I think of them as young. It is relative. Kathleen's the author of multiple books, one of which I read for the press or for your promotion, I don't remember which. And I have it, I'm quoted on the back. There's a blurb for me on the back. That's either from my press report or your promotion, the full professor. But the first one was on La Métrie. The second one, which is one I looked at, was a fascinating book if you haven't seen it. Making Science Social, the Conferences of Renad, which is about a series of conferences that were held in Paris in the 1630s and early 1640s, which were transcribed without ascribing any of the text to the speaker. And they had, what, 2 a week? Is that what it was?
2 topics a week.
2 topics a week. And the topics are fascinating. And it was a real revelation, I thought, as a book about how to think about the scientific revolution as far less linear than we had thought about, because the types of arguments that people were using. And these were all the leading people. I think the only person who you figured wasn't surely there was Descartes. But pretty much all the others looked like people figures probably were there. Mersenne looked like he was there. Pascal, maybe. And then more recently, as Natalie knows, Queens and Mistresses of Renaissance France. Natalie's working on women in politics in 16th century France. So she's familiar with this book. So Kathleen's going to talk to us today about her trajectory as a scholar. Most recently, she's working on an absolutely fascinating project, which will doubtless end up being the main focus of our question and answer, of textbooks being used in evangelical schools today, and how they're studying history and what they learn about different things. Based on our 5-minute conversation in my office, it will be a truly terrifying afternoon. That's all I'll say about it. We'll go on from there.
Okay, thank you. Why don't we first, I'd sort of like to know who all of you are. Jim sent me your names, but not all of you look like your pictures, and not all of you have pictures. So I know Bob, I know Tom.
Hi, I'm Natalie Donnell. I'm a first-year PhD working with Professor Collins, and I work on women in politics. I did my master's paper on Catherine de Medici mostly, and I'm hoping to expand to look at women in the Low Countries in France moving forward. Yeah.
I'm Nathan Michaelwitz. I'm a 5th-year PhD student. I work with Matt Holt over at George Mason University, and I'm writing my dissertation on Franco-Ottoman diplomacy during the French Wars of Religion.
Hey, I'm Sakwan Khan. I'm also like a 5th-year PhD student. Is working on with Professor Collins. I'm writing a dissertation about like religious tolerance and coexistence in the 17th century, with like comparison of like North and South.
We could use some of that now.
My name is Jacob Brown. I'm a 3rd-year PhD student working with Dr. Collins on the French Empire in the late 16th, or late 17th and early 18th century.
I'm Elizabeth Cross. I'm an assistant professor here at Georgetown. I work on the 18th century French Empire, and my current book is on the Compagnie des Indes during the French Revolution.
And you're speaking in Portland opposite my session.
Oh, yes.
Good, I can claim to be at yours. And then go out and have coffee.
Rebecca Andrews. I have survived a few of Professor Collins' courses, and I am working on New Spain, but in some cases touch on early modern Spain.
I'm Erica Lally. I'm studying early 20th century U.S. history, but I'm interested in the methodological questions, which is why I'm here.
I don't know that I'll get to any of those. But
Henriette Bruinsen, former student of Jim's commercial history between France and the Netherlands in the 17th century, and currently working at the National Gallery of Art in a different field.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Jim, for inviting me, though I have to say this is the most disconcerting speaking invitation I have ever gotten. The way Jim initially put it was that he wanted to hear from scholars of a generation before they disappeared. I fully expect to be vaporized and not finish talking about this, and I've been really worried about my health ever since I got the invitation. And he also wanted me to discuss how I came to have the kind of topics that I did, and I thought, maybe he thought there was a grand plan. And as I thought about it, I realized there was no plan whatsoever. So I thought, what could I tell you about a scholarly career or about my scholarly career that you might find somewhat useful? Not that I think I'm a model. You should probably not do many of the things that I did. I should have been in the cohort that finished in 1980, but I was doing other things. And so when I thought about trying to put order on what I've done, I can certainly do that because I'm a historian and I'm used to ordering things that may not seem on the face of it to have any order. But when I started thinking about it, I realized that personal issues play a considerable role in your career in ways that you may not be encouraged to think about, and lots of chance comes into play in ways that you can't predict at all. So I thought if I used my career as a kind of historical artifact, you might be able to identify with some of the issues that I dealt with, though some things have changed considerably for the better. And you might be interested in thinking about the serendipitous and the personal and the professional as sort of all mixed up together over the course of a scholarly career. I did not know that Bob was going to be here, and he could talk about these things just as well as I. I went to graduate school at the University of Chicago, and when I was admitted, I got a letter saying, "Congratulations on your admission. There are no jobs, don't come." And I came anyway. Seriously. And so did 70 other graduate students in my entering class, which was insane but graduate tuition fueled the large faculty and the very small undergraduate program. I went to graduate school because I was good at school. This is a terrible reason to go to graduate school, and one that I have in fact been advising undergraduates at SMU this week that just because they're good at school does not mean they should try to get a PhD. So, I was far more naive than any of you likely were when you went to graduate school, and you will get out of graduate school far more professionalized than I ever was. Things were different with this very large coterie of graduate students. 1 in 12 students who took their PhD orals actually finished a dissertation in our period at Chicago. That's how good things were, right? On the other hand, tuition was only $3,000, but there was no support. Chicago had a policy of never sullying the young minds of undergraduates with graduate school student teaching, so we did none. There were also no real expectations of women in the PhD program. I was told by a professor that it really didn't matter at all what I chose to study or to write my dissertation about, because I would get married and I would have children, and ultimately I would be rich and Republican. Mm-hmm. The last two things have not come to pass. There were no female history professors at the University of Chicago. I have never been taught by a female history professor, even though Hannah Gray was president of the University of Chicago when I started there. Graduate students were also not welcome at professional conferences. On the other hand, Chicago, with its very large coterie of graduate students, allowed them to take courses anywhere. You took 9 courses a year for 3 years. I took courses in, one of my problems, just to lay it all out for you, I have been interested in many things, history, philosophy, French literature, and I have been resistant to specialization, which may not be the best route to a successful career either. But because I was interested in many things, I took courses in the divinity school and the political science department, and that kind of freedom allowed you to find things you might not have otherwise known that you were interested in even looking for. There were 2 experiences that were formative for my interest and absolutely serendipitous. I signed up for a Renaissance seminar. I believed I would be getting Petrarch, humanists, people I knew something about, and instead, the person teaching it was Alan Debus, who was an expert in Paracelsianism, and I did not have a clue who Paracelsus was. And that seminar did nothing but read occult philosophers across the history of science. What that did for me was give me a sense of being in early modern Europe in a way that nothing else did. Because otherwise, the things I was studying could lead me to think that the early modern world wasn't that different. If you're reading occult philosophers in the 16th century, there is absolutely no way you can think that. Right? So this was important to me. The other thing is, I went to graduate school before the internet, and you cannot even imagine what that was like or how inaccessible information was. So I went to graduate school expecting to study with John Wolfe, who actually wasn't there and hadn't been there for several years, but he was still in the catalog. So instead, I found Keith Baker. And Keith was a young assistant professor finishing the Condorcet book that was so significant, and my exposure to him essentially gave me the Enlightenment, which was extremely important to my intellectual interests and the ways in which I was able to combine all of the things I was most interested in. But these were entirely chance. When I was looking for a dissertation topic, graduate students at Chicago were pretty much undirected, and I decided I would write a book on all of the ethical philosophy of the Enlightenment. And then I discovered that Lester Crocker had just written 3 500-page volumes on that topic, so I set that aside and I concentrated on La Mettrie, which turned out to be fortuitous because more than half of his work was medical, and I was able to use him to connect the history of science and medicine to the Enlightenment and try to make a case for the medical approach as being important, and La Mettrie's philosophy as medical, and medicine as being a crucial way to understand the kinds of Reformation goals of society that the Enlightenment had, the ways in which you could use an understanding of the human body to argue for tolerance and acceptance. And La Mettrie was, I also really liked him because he was really iconoclastic. He was willing to step on everyone's toes. I sometimes think this has been my role as a faculty member as well. His first work were translating the works of Herman Boerhaave, which for those of you drawing connections to the Netherlands, he was extremely important in bringing iatrochemistry and an iatromechanism and a clinical approach to teaching medicine. And La Mettrie translated all of those works, and he had been to study with Boerhaave, which gave him a means to criticize French medical practice. All right, if you're going to criticize French medical practice, do you write satires which play on the names of all of the members of the Faculty of Medicine in a perfectly obvious way. For that, he was driven out of Paris. He went to the Netherlands. He wrote Man the Machine, and he's one of the very few people to get driven out of the Netherlands. And he went to Frederick the Great, ultimately. And one of the things I argued is that he made a lot of arguments that Diderot subsequently made, and later figures subsequently made, but there was no reason to accept any of his arguments in 1750. They were far too radical, and no reason for anyone to accept them subsequently. All they could do was tar you with atheist, materialist, or any of the other 18th century epithets. Okay, so I'm working on the on La Maîtrise, and in this process I went on the job market, because you did that back in the day before you had even finished, and much like the situation you'll be facing, jobs were rare and difficult to get. I remember getting several letters which purported to have received 400 letters of application, and my last name begins with W. I read all search files from the back of the alphabet. But one of the things that has actually, I think, worked to my advantage is that nobody got jobs easily. That meant my male compatriots didn't either. Everybody was sort of laboring in this kind of academic Netherland, right? And I had a child, and I did not think, and I still don't think, I was disadvantaged by the fact that I took longer to get my dissertation done than some of my peers, and that I spent time in an unusual job situation, because so were my male peers. My daughter was born when I was writing my dissertation. I had several phone interviews where I only hoped she wouldn't wake up from a nap. Female faculty were rare. When I was on the job market, people were still looking to hire their woman. And female faculty with children were even rarer. And in fact, when I was teaching at either Stanford or SMU, there were very few other female faculty with children. I got a job teaching at Stanford in a teaching and research fellowship program that had me teaching 5 sections of Western Civ, Plato to NATO, discussion sections, admittedly, but I had no teaching experience. So this was fabulous and very useful to me. They read all the kinds of things that I wanted to read and teach about, though I also did all the grading for 120 students every quarter. 2 years later, the University of Dallas hired my husband, and what we have been extremely fortunate. He got a degree from the Committee on Social Thought, and we have always moved together in tandem to various locations. When I got the job at Stanford, we drew a 30-mile radius circle on the map, and he applied to every place, and he got a job at the College of Notre Dame in Belmont, and we just played Pass the Baby back that year. When he was hired at the University of Dallas, I wrote to all the local institutions to see whether I could get a job, and the Department of History at SMU invited me to go to lunch, which turned out to be fortunate. But I actually got a job teaching for the University of Dallas in Rome when I happened to meet the provost at the University of Dallas Christmas party. It doesn't really get any more serendipitous than that. They had a history professor over in Rome who was reading from the textbooks, and students were so discontent that they brought a herd of goats into his classroom. This was a serious problem that needed to be addressed immediately, so I was hired to replace him.
Imagine it.
They were really unhappy, apparently. Okay, so I went to Rome. I taught in Rome. I taught the first half of Western civilization for 2 years, and we traveled with the program. The program went to Greece for 10 days every year. I developed walking tours of Rome, Florence, Venice. I got to live the Western civilization I was teaching and to really understand the Renaissance in a way that was really important to the work I did later and really enjoyable. My son was born in Rome. Things were very different for female faculty then, and it's part of the reason probably that female faculty didn't have children. There was no maternity leave. Has Georgetown come around?
I think so. In my day, there was no
No
leave, there was no
maternity leave.
daycare, there was no nothing.
Okay, so my son was born in Rome, and I was living above where I was teaching, so it worked out okay, and I was back in the classroom a week later. When we planned to return to Dallas, I wrote to all of the institutions I had written to before, and SMU remembered me and hired me as a visiting assistant professor. I did that for 3 years, and then I was told the position would disappear, and I got a tenure-track job at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. The same year my husband had a fellowship to Madison, so it seemed like we were just going to go to the Midwest again. But he was only able to get a job in Chicago, a permanent job. He had tenure already, and we decided a 95-mile commute with 2 children would not work. And SMU had offered me a tenure-track job to get me back. So obviously, this is crazy good fortune and sort of random events, right? Once I was back, I needed a project I could do locally because there was no money for research support. And I remembered the conferences of Théophras Renaud because I had reported on the Paracelsian conferences, but I had also noted all the other weird things that they addressed. And Jim told you some of the ways in which this was a really unusual venture. I was very taken by the fact that they talked about everything: ethics, gender issues, medicine. They used a lot of the rhetorical tropes of the Renaissance, whether it is better to be this or that, why, and they just seemed to open up the entire intellectual world of the 17th century, and they were weird as anything. I mean, one of the first conferences I remember vividly is one on bathing, and there are 12 opinions expressed, and 8 of them are opposed, and 4 of them are in favor. Okay, and Renaud himself was just so innovative. He ran a free medical clinic. He ran a free pharmacy. The Bureau d'Adresse was Craigslist for the 17th century, right? And then he did these conferences. And they, too, were highly unusual in that no speaker was ever to be identified. Speakers were not allowed to cite authorities in making their arguments. Now, you couldn't get away from Aristotle entirely, but still. Okay, so you're laying out for people a range of opinions on a topic and encouraging them to draw their own conclusions. And then what do? You print it out in really cheap paper to have once a week on the bluish paper, and then you do really luxurious volumes that look like the Encyclopédie in which you collect 100 conferences, right? So it was an entree into the 17th century that I found really engaging. I also did it because I needed something I could do locally, and I have this ridiculous propensity to think that everything I'm going to do will be really easy and short. And not only can I not write a short book, but every book I've tried to do takes me into an area that requires a great deal more work. But it's also much more engaging than I ever expected it to be, and that was certainly the case with the Renaud book. All right, so finished that book. I got promoted. As soon as I got tenure, I started teaching summer school because that was one of the sad realities of academic salaries. And so I have done that for some, 20-some years. I've taught every summer. I started out doing it because I had to get my children through school, and now I do it because it's some of the most rewarding teaching I do. I decided that it would be better to teach in Paris in July than Dallas. So I have taught in SMU in Paris for 20 years. Okay, so now I have worked out a program that I do with my classicist colleagues that is Rome and Paris, that sort of goes from early Rome up to the French Revolution. I do the French part, she does the Rome part. I get to spend part of the summer in my two favorite cities. Okay, so as part of that experience, we went to the Loire Valley as every summer, and students simply could not fathom the fact that Henry II was married to Catherine de Medici, who was the same age as he, and Diane de Poitiers was 20 years older and his mistress for all of his life, from the time he was 16 until he died at 40. And they just couldn't fathom this. And yet, everywhere we went in the Loire Valley, you saw signs of Catherine de Medici and Henry, but you also saw a great many signs of Diane de Poitiers. And I started thinking about royal mistresses, and I fully realized there was such a historical artifact. There was hardly any women's history. I can't remember being impressed by a single woman in any of the things I studied in early modern European history as a graduate student, period. So, but I started thinking, these women are obviously influential in the arts. The official mistress was a common practice in France. It was inaugurated at the time, close to the end of the 100 Years' War, and I thought, I could tell a different story about the French Renaissance by using these women. You couldn't use just the mistresses because they weren't always prominent enough, and they were very fertile and they tended to bear many children and die young. So you couldn't get a really strong narrative going, right? But if you combine them with the queens, you would get different images and be able to narrate the whole period, which is what I tried to do. And that was great fun. I did it as a fun project. It is the only book I have written for which I got fan mail. I had an English woman write to me and say that she had taken my book to the beach, and thinking, maybe she'd get to it, and she hadn't been able to put it down. To which my very irreverent daughter said, some people have higher standards for beach reading than we do. Okay, so now, as Jim told you, I am doing something very strange and totally unconnected to anything I have ever done, and it is a feature of the fact that I live in Texas, which may be a foreign country to you. But what has happened in Texas has become much more common across the rest of the country. As the state legislature became very solidly in the control of Republicans, they gerrymandered. Texas was Democratic when I moved there, right? They have gerrymandered districts. And like all gerrymandered districts, they elect more extreme representatives, particularly of the Republican Party, but to some degree of the Democratic Party. School board elections are similarly of extremists. And Texas sets the standards for much of the nation for textbook production, right? In 2010, there were representatives on the board. The Republicans were all creationists, all evangelicals. They were going after science, but their next target was history, because they had a very specific history that they think every student should know. And that history is most important for American history, and it is the Christian nation argument that you hear rhetorically all the time. But what they did with the 18th century to make sure that the French Enlightenment could have no influence on 18th century America, they wrote Thomas Jefferson out and they substituted Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin as influences on 18th century America, which frankly made no sense to me until I figured out that they wanted a religious foundation for nature's laws, not a deist foundation. And they wanted to argue that all of the founders were influenced by Calvin's fundamental notion of sin. Because for them, the argument is that all the fundamental documents of American history are shaped by the notion of sin, and therefore that any human activities are pointless. This is a very strange. There are very many strange arguments in the state standards, which are very clearly directed towards an explicitly fundamentalist Protestant retelling of American history, but also to some degree to world history. And I started looking at the most significant fundamentalist curricula for world history, because I wanted to know where this sense of the historical narrative came from. And so what I've been doing is developing a book that treats each period and what kinds of arguments are being used, why those arguments are being made, and why we should care about them, or why they're dangerous for 21st century Americans. And as French historians or French specialists, there is a great deal for you to be offended about. In particular because, well, so for instance, France was never Christian. Clovis was just an expedient convert, unlike the virtuous Anglo-Saxons. Free market capitalists were Reformation Protestants who were the first genuine Christians. 17th century France is an example of failed politics and failed economics, and 17th century England is just no problem at all. So it would be a very strange narrative for your period, but it's equally strange for all periods. But they make a lot of arguments that are really significant for all of us. For instance, you have to identify the other and root them out. You have to understand that the nation must be Christian, that people must be coerced into behaving according to biblical law, which is largely unspecified, but could be extremely coercive, and on the more extreme fringes of the fundamentalist view, it is extremely coercive. God sanctions no political resistance whatsoever, and you might be aware of that kind of argument being deployed to suggest that the fact that Donald Trump is president is what God intends, and you simply have no right to question that. Right? These are profoundly anti-democratic, right? And of course, the Enlightenment is a linchpin for the development of the modern world and a source of much evil. But one of the ironies of my current work is to recognize that even though these textbooks denounce the Enlightenment, they are very peculiarly indebted to it and share some of their approaches to history. For instance, for both the Enlightenment and these crazy textbooks, ideas are the central actors in history. Both groups retell history to make their case. If you just think for a minute about the preliminary discourse of the Encyclopédie, it has defined the positivist notion of the history of science that is in effect still, right? And these people are using history as a vehicle to, as the Enlightenment did, change the way people think. Right? So they're using Enlightenment tools against the Enlightenment and towards very different ends. They are using it to undermine reason and science and replace it with religion. But they are also both intent on forming a kind of philosophical or political philosophical party that will shape political agendas much in the way that Enlightenment philosophes work. Okay, so that's what I'm doing now, and one of my biggest fears is that at some point in the future, when I am in the home, this will be the history I remember and think of as real. But to help prevent that from happening, I am going to finish this book, hopefully this year, and flee back to the sane world of 18th century medicine, where even if they were bleeding you all the time, they understood why they were doing it and they had scientific and rational principles behind it. Okay, so what I'm looking to are a group of 5 doctors writing at the time of 1750 or so. They are all physicians who are well trained in philosophy, making philosophical arguments, writing philosophical texts. They are also popularizers of medicine and reformers. So they have plans like, let's take all the children out to the countryside and vaccinate them for smallpox and have them write, daily letters to their parents and recover from vaccination. And let's send questionnaires out to the countryside so people can, draw on a map of the human body their symptoms and send them back for diagnosis. I think we'll be doing this for healthcare in America pretty soon. But anyway, they're all reformers, all popularizers, all philosophers, and then they are medical journalists, and they write really bad medical literature. One of my favorites is Antoine Le Camus, who writes a book on how to retain beauty in old age that does adopt the high protein, low carbohydrate diet well in advance of its day, right? But he has a lot of advice on how to deal with skin ailments, and it is placed in the context of a kind of Persian letters-esque novel. So you have scenes of intense passion interrupted by discussions of dental care. So those are the kinds of popular medical works that they're doing. Anyway, this seems far saner to me than any of the textbooks that I'm working on now. Okay, so what I was thinking about is that you should let your personal life intrude on your academic life. I'm sure this would have been a reprehensible statement at the University of Chicago when we were there, right? And you should make room for chance, because you don't know what opportunities will develop. You will want to do different sorts of things at different stages of your career. You'll be asked to take on institutional challenges, and with every opportunity comes new developments and new interests in ways that you cannot possibly predict. One of the things that always strikes me, and I do it too, is that when you go on the job market, you will be asked to talk about your first book, your second book, and maybe your third book in a way that is completely unrealistic. You should certainly have something to say, but you should recognize that you're not bound to those topics and that things will develop, right? So happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you. All right. Questions?
Yeah?
So you did talk about how it might have been seen as an impediment to not overly specialize in one particular area and to kind of follow your interests. And have you found that to be the case when, in terms of finding jobs or anything like that? Have you found there to be any benefit or any detriment in terms of employment?
Okay, I can't tell you what would have happened had I been more conventional. Right?
Right.
I don't think I would have enjoyed what I've done nearly as much. And ultimately, it seems to me, this is a hard enough career that if you're not doing it because you love it, and if it's not inspiring you, and if you are, I mean, I know a fair number of academics who essentially self-plagiarize to move ahead, right? And I mean, I don't think you can do that very much in early modern Europe because the book market is not that way, right? I have a lot of Americanist colleagues who find it very easy to sort of retread similar ideas, and maybe that would have been more career enhancing or more lucrative, but I'm not sure it's a possibility for early modernists in any case, and I wouldn't have wanted to do it. Yeah. I mean, when I finished La Maîtrise, I might have done more work on French physiology, but I didn't, so I can't tell you what would have happened.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one for 1 second, but that when you're getting jobs, it matters, particularly you're teaching at a small college, because my first job was at Lafayette, and Lafayette has 9 people in the department. So everyone has to cover 2 important fields, right? The American is sort of a bit different, but you know, the guy who did modern Europe had to teach the Middle East. There was a woman who did England and Ireland, and she trained, college paid her 2 summers to train to do the history of Africa. Right, so when I went there, they had a job in early modern. The secondary field was European intellectual history. So one of my required classes there was to teach 2 semesters of European intellectual history, and I had taught Columbia's contemporary civ class, and I had taken classes in graduate school in Russian literature and all kinds of various other things. And as Bob Kreis remembers, I went to graduate school in Russian history, not French history. So I had a background where I could make an argument that yes, I can teach a class like this, and that was fundamental in me getting a job, because you had to be able to cover 2 things. And I don't think that's unusual. That's still the case at Lafayette. I can't imagine it would be any different at a small college that has 5, 7, 9 members. You've got to be able to teach broadly, not just your. And I mean, a couple of years ago, I got to teach history 099. I'm teaching a class on Louis XIV in Versailles, and I've been teaching at the undergraduate level since, not counting graduate school where I taught a couple of classes, since 1981. That was the first time I had ever taught an undergraduate class focused on 17th century French. Right? So if you think that that's where your career is going to go because you're doing 16th and 17th century French and you're going to get to teach that, well, it doesn't always work that way.
I would just, along this line, versatility is really important. And I don't think, I mean, I was even earlier than you, but I didn't get any sense of anybody directing me as to doing anything in particular. And I was fortunate I did Western Civ as a field, because Chicago has this wonderful program with great books and stuff like that. But Keith Baker, I was his first, you were a later student of his, I was his first. He didn't say anything like, think about this topic, which, by the way, he recommended that I do, which, thank God, as a book. I mean, I didn't conceptualize, I mean, that's the advice you give, which is very sound advice, but I didn't. I just had to finish my PhD and had to get a job. I mean, the year that I was on the job market, there were 9 positions in early modern French history. The next year, there were 2. And I happened to get one, but then the bottom fell out of the field. But I wasn't prepared, and I took fields not with any thought in mind as to why I was taking these fields as opposed to any others. And so you have to be much more intentional and think in terms of being versatile, because you may be called upon to teach courses completely out of your field or even slightly related to it.
Yeah, I had to teach America in the 60s one year at Lafayette. They had an overflow in the class, and it was mandatory. It was a seminar for the history majors, and so they developed a second section, and they said, well, you got to cancel your early modern class, which only has 8 people in it, and teach the 18 people and or whatever it was, 20 people in 60s America. I said, well, I'm not an American historian. They said, you lived through it. That's good enough. I'm serious. That's what they said to me. So I had to teach America in the 60s. Right? That was fun.
On the issue of intentionality, it seems as if a lot of your the jobs you got were not on the formal job market. That it was riding around. You're going to be in Dallas, so you need to ride around, or you're going to be in California, and you just ride around to different areas. Is that something that might have been particular to the time, or that, you know, the job market being as it is right now, when instead, riding around to local small colleges when you come out actually being a possible avenue to try?
Okay, so I was chair of the department for 2 terms, and I got letters from people that way, and so things would come up. I could hear from somebody at the University of Texas at Arlington saying, I need a French historian. Do you know, to fill in next semester, do you know someone? And I could say, I just heard from so-and-so who's moved to Dallas. So there is that sort of market. One of the things that was different and was far preferable is universities had not yet discovered that they could thoroughly exploit people as adjuncts while we were on the market. They just simply didn't hire, right? And that's changed things a lot. Somebody came to speak to the graduate students at SMU a couple years ago who sort of said, for your own survival, before you start adjuncting, decide exactly how long you're willing to do it, because things might develop, but they might not, and you might be sort of consigning yourself to essentially academic slave labor, and that truly did not exist, even though there were all those people on the job market. So I think that's how a lot of spousal arrangements have worked in the past and still do. My spouse is moving to X city, I'm going to write all around, and maybe there will be something, and maybe you get an opportunity, as I did, to have it ultimately turn into a full-time position.
I'll just have to offer another old war story too, but that how things just suddenly, turn up sometimes. And I don't know if this is true anymore at all, but I finished my PhD while I was doing a 1-year job in Kansas. Nothing was coming up. It was one of the worst years. And so I walked around the campus and I thought, well, maybe even the French department has something. Do they have a French civ thing or something like that? I talked to the chairman. He said, well, would you be willing to teach French? And I said, well, sure, of course. So anyway, I was, again, looking everywhere. And in August, they said, oh, just down the road, this little small college of Ottawa has lost their French teacher. She just left it. And so they need someone half-time. So that was what I did the next year.
So I told you that when I first got the job at Stanford, we drew the circle around the map, and my husband got hired by someone who'd been an alternate for an NEH. And so they had 6 philosophy courses suddenly available for him to teach. He had never taught before either, and of course he said, I can do this, right?
Oh yeah.
And he had the worst teaching experience I could ever imagine, in that he taught a 6-hour Saturday class to Air Force personnel at Moffett Field. And he remembers to this day that his teaching evaluations, one of them said, it was like from 1 to 10 or whatever, and somebody wrote, depended on the day. Some were 10s, some were 1s.
That's better than
We all can relate
Yeah.
So something we kind of talk about with everyone when they come here is how you see technology changing the way that historians, but also French historians, do their work. And as somebody who regularly gets to go to Paris or Rome and is closer to the archives, how do you
I think
see
it's
the shift?
become infinitely easier. I mean, I can see that pretty much everything I used for Queens and Mistresses is now online. I mean, the Bibliothèque Nationale. I mean, I couldn't justify going abroad to do La Métrie, or I could still justify Théophras Renad, but not Queens and Mistresses, and not most of what I'll be working on for the French doctors either. I have worked primarily in printed sources, and they are being digitalized at a prodigious rate. In fact, people in France now complain that the Bibliothèque Nationale is not crowded in the summer because so many people are just staying home to do their research. And otherwise, in terms of technology, doing, I mean, it makes things easier, though, I'm going to remain on the dinosaur side of this particular development.
So I'm curious about the new project,
Mhm.
since we talked about it just a little bit. But since we're Europeanists, well, we have
Mhm.
one lonely exception. You know, you mentioned a couple of the ways that they present our particular period.
Mhm.
And it's a very, shall we say, Anglophile presentation of European history. But can you tell us a little bit more about some of the elements of how they present, let's say, 20th century Europe?
20th century Europe. It's very sad.
That's true.
Yes, 20th century Europe. Okay, so the way they present 20th century Europe begins in the 18th century. The world goes awry in the 18th century, and God essentially turns his favor, it's a covenantal understanding of history, away from Europe and toward the United States. All things will be good in the United States. There are actually, even horrifyingly enough, biblical justifications of slavery, and there are discussions of labor woes that are set in terms of biblical citations in favor of slavery, so that no worker ever has any right to complain about his employer based on biblical slavery, which is apparently the model for work in the modern world. Okay, so there's that. Then you have the revolutionary tradition in France and throughout Europe, and that is a sign of sin, and one of the ways in which it's clear that Europe has failed. You get to the 19th century in Europe, and of course you have Marx and heavens, you have Darwin, right? So I mean, you have the it's really interesting for me there are no human agents in these histories at all. It is all a story about the evil consequences of ideas. And so once you get to the 19th century with Marx and Darwin, they are the direct causes for the two world wars that are set in motion as punishments for sin. And it's just the way it is, yeah.
How ubiquitous are these textbooks within the Texas school system?
Okay, these are not, okay, so part of what Texas did was write much of this narrative into their state standards, okay? And then what happens is textbooks that major publishers produce have to include 80% of what they stipulate. Okay, so, and they do this cyclically, right? So the textbooks had to be published, they were the market for 2014. Okay, so I volunteered to read those textbooks. I was rejected as a reader in favor of a used car salesman in Houston. Okay, so, okay, but I read some of them anyway. And what I was looking for in particular was what they did with Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin, right? And they couldn't figure out what to do, so they just listed them as religious thinkers, because some of the things that had been put in as standards were just too absurd to be included in any way. But I did go down and testify before the Texas State School Board. And what I had chosen to focus on was all the ways in which Moses was suddenly a central figure in the construction of all of the primary documents of the American founding. Moses was the greatest influence on the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
I have just a question about the theological schools in Texas and so on. I imagine they're not all quite as crazy as some of this evangelical. Aren't there some kind of respectable scholars at Texas Christian or some of these other?
Oh yeah, well, and they're not even evangelical in the same way that SMU is not Methodist actually either. I mean, there is a bishop on the board, but that's it. And this is not a Texas phenomena in that the school board members were really conservative. The school board members solicit experts. anybody gets to be an expert if 2 school board members think he or she is. So they brought in a lot of experts from all over the country, but primarily from places like Liberty University, and so the deck was stacked in terms of their expertise, not in terms of their status in Texas.
Have you been able to, I mean, I'm thinking organizing, is there any pushback from established religion or theology scholars, you know, in Texas?
About state, well, yes. Okay, so when the school board has hearings, imagine this, you're allowed to talk for 2 minutes. So they did have like Islamic scholars and representatives of the Jewish tradition and get up and testify that you cannot just talk about Islam as jihad, for instance, and you cannot characterize Hinduism this way. And so the school board, the textbook publishers were supposed to go back and make some modest corrections, but it's kind of a done deal once the standards get set, right? And the standards are set by these experts. Okay, so what they produced is a narrative that is much more Protestant than it should be, but they are not the crazy people that I'm working on. The crazy textbooks I'm working on are published by fundamentalist publishers. Okay, the reason they're so dangerous is because the school board members all over the country on the extreme right are educated with these curricula. And as states initiate voucher systems, something like 80 to 90% of the voucher schools use these curricula. And of course, Betsy DeVos wants to apply these voucher programs across the country. Yeah.
But ultimately, the voter votes the school board membership, correct?
Yes.
So
in these very gerrymandered districts, so you have, say, 4 Democrats who are all minorities, right? And then you have 5 Republicans who outvote them on everything.
So it's a gerrymandering that really is at the bottom.
Yes, and these same kinds of standards were in play in Colorado. I don't know if you remember that students, high school students, went out in protest because the state standards said no one had ever protested anything in America. And so these things are getting written into, because what's happened is very conservative organizations, usually supported by groups like the Koch brothers, write legislation for the states. They write up bills and it's sort of plug in the name of the state. And then the standards get written to conform with those sorts of things. So one of the things I think that happened is after 1994, when there was a tremendous debate about high school standards, the religious and conservative right decided they weren't going to deal at the national level, they were going to work from the ground up, and they have been incredibly effective at the state level. And so that's how this is having such a profound effect. Yeah.
Did you find it challenging to sort of commit to writing a new project and researching a new project that was in many ways so far from your original area of training? Or did you feel like this was an intervention you just had to make?
Once again, I thought it would be really easy. How complicated could this be? And what makes it really complicated is not just figuring out why they're saying what they're saying and what the purpose is, but also I've discovered, and I've had to do a lot of work on this, they're telling the story of American evangelicalism. They're mapping their own history and all of the issues they fought. Anti-Catholicism, anti-communism, anti-internationalism, every campaign they have fought since the 19th century is replicated in the story they tell. So this is the only history they understand, right? And they're trying to make it the only history we understand, or the only history Americans understand.
I assume these are required texts, right?
Okay,
So how do, you're a teacher, you come out of a SMU or University of Texas, and you certainly are not being trained to teach this crap. what are you supposed to do? I mean, how can you
Okay, so-
retain your job?
Okay, so, well, if you're hired at a Christian school, you
No, but
usually
these
take
are
the
not,
pledge,
aren't these being used in public schools as well?
funded by vouchers. Okay, there are two issues. There are the ways in which this narrative gets included in state standards. And of course, anytime anyone protests about the state standards in Texas, they say, of course, the teacher can add other materials. It's sort of like the way in which creation science gets now taught along with evolution in science curriculum. So you can get a textbook that is very clearly a Protestant narrative, and the argument is made that you as a teacher in the public schools can introduce other material, or you can complicate the narrative, right? Where it becomes problematic is where all your fellow historians in your school's faculty are more wedded to this other narrative and exert pressure on you, and I have heard about that from public school teachers. The people who are using the fundamentalist textbooks, I'm sure, are all true believers, and the other area where it is extremely influential are all of the homeschoolers. And we don't have any idea how many of them there are, because neither Texas nor Pennsylvania require you to register homeschoolers, and they're two of the biggest markets. So we now, and all of these curricula came into play in the 1970s with the development of the religious right. Okay? And part of the reason they're so significant is they have been tied to the political right. The political right benefits from this narrative. It tells you that employees should be slaves. It tells you that no one has a right to resist, and it tells you most fundamentally that wealth is a sign of divine favor. Okay, and that they explicitly say, capitalism is the only economic system God favors.
Well, that was in Kansas schools too, I know, my wife taught there. I wanted to ask you one very general question that might be of interest. The work you're doing, is just fantastic work, it's so important. And I wonder if you could just address more broadly just how historians deal with all the issues of advocacy that come up. Where do you draw lines, or where does the role of historian come in to any kind of advocacy?
I mean, I did feel I needed to do this, and it is advocacy. I'm trying, as I'm cutting out words, to go through and take out, not to not dilute the argument, but to cut out anything that seems overtly polemical. But I don't know. If I'm going to have a group of colleagues read it early in the next semester, if they don't get the point, I'll put the polemics back in. I mean, because really the points have to be made, right?
I want to jump in here for 1 second, because I have a grandson who's now a high school senior. So I've been watching this process in Arlington, Virginia, which is a relatively left-wing community, all Democrats, etc. And his textbooks have been appalling, right? And I know from projects involving textbook publishers and editors how the big publishers we're talking about are under a lot of pressure from organized groups to put things in, to take things out, all kinds of different stuff.
Right.
So they had a textbook when he was in the 4th grade of Virginia history. And I'm looking through, and every little chapter they had 2 or 3 sentences about the importance of banking at that moment, right? And how 17th century Virginia was terrible because there were no banks, and therefore there was no currency, et cetera, et cetera. And, I went to the school and I said, there were no banks anywhere in the 17th century, which you're using this term, and they certainly had currency, so this argument is transparently false. Who wrote, there were plenty of other problems too, who wrote this textbook? All right, so there were other parents who complained. We get to February, and it turns out that the textbook claims that large numbers of slaves volunteered to work for the Confederate Army. Well, that was one step too far, and then they threw the textbook out, and they brought in something else. Well, it turned out that the woman who had written this had gotten her information on that point from the website of the Confederate Veterans of America, and was, of course, not a historian, and was just a right-wing idiot who had put this thing together. This is Arlington, Virginia. This is not some
Jim,
rural place in Texas.
That puts the onus completely on the school board to say this is drivel,
Right.
and not prescribe this particular
Absolutely.
textbook.
But you have a
Absolutely. And it's an
dentist.
all Democratic school board. The school board is 100%, there hasn't been a
Right.
Republican member
Right.
of the school board
So
in
there's
Arlington,
no
Virginia
excuse.
since the 1980s.
But
So
you know,
they don't have any excuse that this is, we were gerrymandered out of it. There's no
Right.
excuse for this. The other stuff in the textbooks, now when he gets to high school, every sentence that I read in his textbook is transparently, obviously put in there by a special interest group. Right?
Wow.
Left and right, I have to say. They're even-handed. The left gets 2 sentences, the right gets 2 sentences, and you're reading this thing, think this is just appalling. And you wonder why the students come so badly prepared to take freshman history here. But you read his textbooks in one of the best public school districts in the United States. And this
Wow.
stuff is just appalling. Part of it in the high school, I have to say, is that the Commonwealth of Virginia approves a limited number of textbooks. And so you must use one of those textbooks. They don't just say one, it's like 6 of them. And so the local school board is restricted. They can pick which one they want, but they can't just go out and buy one of their own. Doesn't Texas use like a uniform buying policy where the whole state buys the same
No.
textbooks or something?
No, and that's why all the publishers come to court Texas, because they will approve certain textbooks.
Right.
The big flap of the recent production of textbooks is when McGraw-Hill published a textbook that was accepted that depicted slaves in fields and talked about them as workers.
Right, yeah, I remember.
So,
reading
I
about
mean, you
that.
have to get a national issue on the table to
Right.
have it.
So back to the bankers. All right, so why were the bankers in there? I'm reading in the business page in the New York Times not long after this. I read the business page all the time because that's where the real news is. The front page is all about Trump, so the business page has actual news on it. And there's an article there about a retired head of the American Institute of Bankers, whatever they call it, or Association of Bankers, who's a history buff. And he has made it his mission in life to introduce proper history about the history of banking into textbooks all over America. What a coincidence that they happen to have a couple of and everything said about banks was positive. Right? This was right after, obviously, the collapse and everybody, the bad things saying about banks. And so this was a deliberate effort by the American banking industry to get stuff in the textbooks to make little kids think that banks are wonderful and will take great care of them when they grow up.
You might be interested in the most recent 20th century history. The last chapter begins with Ronald Reagan's America, which is fabulous. The world turns around in 1980, and it has been just fabulous ever since.
Until 2016. Can't even better.
Well, we haven't gotten to that, but and it's clear. I mean, every sort of Republican platform position is written in as a success. Deregulation, lowered taxes. Every good ruler has lowered taxes. Every Republican president has been fabulous on defense, fabulous on the family, fabulous economically, and successful in military ventures. And every Democratic president has been a complete and total disaster. And that's the last. I mean, there's no way you could possibly get through this curricula and think there was a virtuous Democrat, socialists are going to hell in handcarts. And every Republican economic policy is driven by God's plan, right? The economy becomes the place where God implements his plan. And any intervention in God's plan by any human being thwarts God. So any social policy is absolutely anathema.
But every time you get into schools, education, and God, you just have to think, every public school, starting with kindergarten, the first thing you do every morning is to say the Pledge of Allegiance. So from the age of 5, these kids have to believe, or are told to believe, there's one God, there is liberty, and there is justice for all. So it's not just evangelicals or the fringe. Everybody is already indoctrinated in the sense of God directs America's fabulous future, present.
I might take it a little bit off, so if there are other questions on the topic.
You go.
So I have a question just about timing in your career. Like, at what point do you decide upon your next project? Because it sounds like you know what you're going to be writing your next book on, even as you're still writing your current one. How do you decide, like, this is definitely what I want to work on next, and sort of at what point is that timing-wise?
I think it's usually near the end of the project that you've done, though you can get derailed. I mean, I think what my next project was probably, I had ideas about it when I finished La Maîtrise, and I just didn't go in that direction. And I never thought I'd do Queens and Mistresses, but I mean, one of the things I argued in the Théophras Renad book is I argued against the positivist story about the history of science, but I also argued against the notion of the profession of scientists that was being developed by social historians of science at the time. I mean, Renad's people were anonymous, right? How antithetical is that to the culture of the scientist and the privileging of the scientist, right? They were not identified as belonging to academies. They were not part of clear schools of thought. They debated Cartesian mechanism, but they didn't necessarily say, we're subscribing to this, right? The other thing that's really odd is they had 2 hours of conferences every Monday, and they got transcribed and printed. One was a scientific topic, one was more rhetorical, and then they had an hour of scientific experimentation, and they didn't write that up because that was less important than the conferences. Okay, so in a way, they were discussing science, they were treating all the scientific issues, but not in the sense of the sociology of science, right? And so for Queens and Mistresses, it was something I was interested in, something I hadn't ever studied, and I was chair of the department. So I needed something I could do sort of episodically as well. And for this new project, it's advocacy, and again, I thought, you know, this is worth a few months of my life, and then it's more than that.
Well, it's Rebecca. I thought I saw your hand in the back there.
Yeah, so I have a 15-month-old daughter, so I am envisioning you being very productive and thinking to myself, I'd like to be that productive. So is there anything that, if looking through all the time that you spent having young kids, old kids, any tricks of the trade of something that you'd say never, like, wake up and write 10 pages every morning, or like, you know, something that would be
useful,
really,
pragmatic.
Yeah, like a logistical.
Okay, so one thing. Okay, so you know, you want to be productive, and you're having years that you're not productive, and you've got little kids running around. I have a theory that I've told people, and I think it's kind of reassuring. I think a really good academic career is a book a decade. And so you're having your children, maybe your 30s decade, you don't finish that book till 40, maybe after. And then you have your 40s book, and your 50s book, and your 60s book. And that's a really good career. It really is. But maybe some decades are just a little bit longer, right? When I did the Renad book, I was in sort of, I did an incredible amount of writing at Little League baseball games, especially double headers. They go on forever, and your kid only bats every hour or so, right? So it's not a big deal. So try to write anywhere. Another thing I started doing that was useful is carving out time in coffee shops away from the office and away from phones, and just making sure that I got some writing time no matter what it was. So if you're really busy and you have write up what you read as you read it before you forget. And just so you've got something, you can always go back to it and use it.
And have a pencil or something and a piece of paper next to your bed in case you wake up in the middle of the night with a brilliant idea. Somehow coalesces everything you've been trying to think of, and it comes together, and then in the morning you can't read what you wrote.
You didn't watch Seinfeld. I'm going to jump in on that one too for a minute, because I've done it both 3 kids with a partner, and we did 50-50, and then on my own as a single parent. And I'll say a couple of things about it. The first one is never do something without your children that you can do with your children. Right? Like go shopping, whatever it is, never, ever spend 1 minute doing something without your children that you can drag the kid along, right? That, you can't imagine, that's a really important thing to saving time.
They'll talk to you in the car.
Well, I mean, you have a limited amount of time without your children. Why would you waste it going shopping for food? You can take your kids with you. Yes, it's unpleasant to have 3 children under 5 in the supermarket with you. Trust me. It's, you know, but you can take them.
And they have carts for junior shoppers.
No, they have all kinds of running around the store, and you know, I never had any problem with this. You know, they throw a tantrum, and as you probably imagine, knowing me, nobody threw any tantrums in the supermarket with me, so that was not a big issue. All right, but.
You might
know,
yourself.
What? Yeah, myself, exactly. I threw my tantrum when I got home, right. But, you know, finding time to write is very, very difficult. And so the moments that you can have to yourself, you've got to have to yourself. You can't be wasting those moments on stuff that could be done with someone else. So that's, I think, a key element. And I would also agree with Kathleen that finding time to write away from everybody, ideally if you can block out some period of time. And be realistic. The median time to book in our department is, first book, is between 8 and 10 years. And the people who've been most productive produce a book about every 8 to 10 years. If you look at their career, you know, somebody who's been here for 30 years, typically they'll have maybe 4 books, right? Very few people in academia write 2 books. They write 1 or they write 3 or more, right? That's almost universally the case if you look at departments around the country, look at our department. And the people, they don't write a whole bunch, you know, they're not writing a book that's any good in 3 or 4 years. So I think that's exactly right. I think 8 to 10 years, think about your subsequent books, that's the way you're doing it.
I try not to wake up and think the way Bob does. But one thing I found useful is use your recording device on your iPhone when you're like driving and some idea occurs to you, because it'll disappear. But if you've got it on your phone,
Yeah. Especially
got
if you have kids.
During the midnight feeding.
Yeah.
Natalie.
Different topic. I was just wondering about your book project on Texas. What do you see as being the market for that book, and have you experienced any backlash? Does anyone know that you're writing it who's mad about it?
Okay, so the president of the university, when I did the state school board, I became a meme because I was asked by a Democratic representative on the school board what I thought the takeaway would be from my 2 minutes of testimony, and I said, I thought students might believe that Moses was the first American. And so this got picked up by, like the New York Times and the Dallas Morning News. And so the president and the provost got letters asking how such a person could be teaching at Southern Methodist University. And I suspect there will be a lot of pushback. I have friends who've suggested I, publish anonymously, but and about the market, I think my market has to be primarily historians, because I don't think historians know that this is out there unless they query their students. And even if their students say really strange things, they won't know where it came from, right? So I think beyond historians, it ought to be people who are interested in education. So I'm not sure, And I mean, one reason I did Queens and Mistresses is because publishers don't like long books, and I don't write short books, and the history of science community doesn't really like Unconventional Views of the History of Science. So I had a hard time getting that book published. I got it published in a series on science and culture at the University of Oklahoma. I had trouble even getting it read. And so another reason I did Queens and Mistresses is I thought, somebody will want this. And it was accepted a week after I sent it out. So sex and violence apparently are.
Violence. As editor of series at Cambridge, I can tell you, violence is number one. Actually, sex is only 3.
What's
Food.
second? Oh, food.
Food sells really well. Right? Sex is actually a distant third. Interesting enough, you would have thought. War is number 1 on the hit parade. Pun intended.
How did the department react to you writing outside of your field? I mean, we kind of beaten around the bush, but I mean, was there any pushback against that?
None.
Oh, great.
Okay, well, first of all, I had just stepped down after 2 terms as chair.
Yeah.
Oh.
So I'm sure if I had done that as a second project, I don't know whether there would have been any pushback. I mean, I'm in a very collegial department, and other people on the faculty were involved in these textbook issues, and people's interests evolve as the field evolves, right? So I don't think there would have been any, and there certainly wouldn't have been any after promotion to full.
Are a lot of the public school teachers with you on this?
I don't know. I haven't.
Bet they would be.
Does the American Historical Association have an educational foundation that you can do your marketing through them, and that there is a need for your book and use them as a vehicle?
I suspect they would be reluctant to do anything like that, given funding out of Washington these days.
Also, the fiasco of the national history standards in the 1950s. I mean,
The
1990s.
Yeah.
A follow-up on that. When you were talking about historians not being really familiar with that, do you think the recent episode with the AP textbook, what was it, in Texas or in New Mexico on Latina history that was accepted, and the AHA went to bat against it because it was inherently racist, do you think the popularization of that particular issue might have brought more information toward your particular topic?
I hadn't thought of it. Maybe. That Latino textbook was written by one of the experts from Liberty University, Cynthia Dunbar, and it was so flagrant. I mean, I think on issues of race, I suspect people are more willing to weigh in than sort of Christianity, for instance.
How many women in your department?
There are now 8.
Out of?
24. I was I mean, part of the reason SMU wanted me back is the last woman had left, and so I was the only one.
Well, I think, when did Hopkins get their first woman in 1990? They're the oldest PhD program in history in the United States. It was right around 1990 or so, maybe a little after that.
And once
So
you
it's a
have
little
one,
hard to go back to that mentally, that universe, because it's not really the universe we live in happily anymore. But it's not that long ago.
Yeah, and hiring women was apparently the sort of standard that is in the academy is once you get a department that is a third women, gender becomes a non-issue in hiring, and that's been my experience in the department. When there were 1 or 2, it was always male candidate versus female, and people lining up according to gender or the expectation.
Do we need another woman?
Do we need another woman? Right, and it's a non-issue. There are still, though, very, very few full professors who are female at SMU. Under 30 in a faculty of 579 tenured faculty.
And here, for a long time, the pattern was women who had children got stuck at associate, and women without children could move on to full.
So
Because they could write a second book.
one thing I would urge you to do is to do service carefully. To do service that is in your expertise, service that fosters your career development. otherwise, female faculty in particular are in danger of becoming part of the what I call the virtuous woman category. Because I had a meeting with the provost who asked me to serve on a committee evaluating all tenure and promotion cases, and I demurred, saying that I was over-serviced like most female full professors, and that there were surely many qualified people who could do this work, and that really the university needed to pay more attention to the competent women category, because at least in my experience, women have proven to be willing to do service, really competent in doing it, and I know some of my male colleagues have cultivated incompetence and they're never asked to do anything.
Learned helplessness.
As a former department chair, I'm not commenting.
You don't know my colleagues, you know
Well,
it is.
I know my colleagues, I'm not saying a word. Fortunately, some of them have now retired.
Interesting you say that. Just as a historical note, when I was at NEH, one of the projects I visited was a fascinating graduate conference on the graduate teaching of U.S. women's history, which was held at Wingspread. I think it was in 89 or 90. But this was one big issue, they said, for anyone who has that position of teaching women's history at the graduate level. They were just swamped with absolutely every kind of concern, every duty, and counseling all the women in the department. It was just huge.
It's even worse for African American faculty, because they want diversity on the committees and there's so few African American faculty, they're just deluged with requests.
Sure.
It's really awful, I have to say. It's an additional burden, it's just. And if you're an African American woman, I imagine it's a double whammy. But anyway, maybe one more question and then everyone can slake their thirst outside. Feed that hereditary hunger that all graduate students have.
I want to follow up the textbook situation you told me that, because it reminds me of my experience in my country, because it's my bachelor degree is a history education, and then I was a lecturer for 3 years in the military academy. So in that year especially in my country is a conservative regime, and they try to adopt a single universal textbook on the national level. In my country is the textbook system is adopted the universal system. So it's in every year is many publishers is submitted their textbook sample, and then it's the central government is review that, and then is they confirm that you can use that textbook. So it's maybe in every year 7 or 8 textbook is confirmed by the central government. But it's in that 2 years ago and 3 years ago is my government is try to reissue that kind of system, and then is they try to make a single universal textbook, because they thought that is the previous textbook is always advocated the how can I say democratic movement, or so they ignore the military dictatorships, economic growth, something like that. So in that time is as a historian, I was really frustrated, because it's I made a petition to the central government, but it's as you know that is in the last year is my government is president was kicked out by the impeachment movement. So but it's until that time is the government is didn't listen any petition, any the objective voices. So as a historian is how do you deal with that kind of backlash in the Texas that situation? Because in my experience is I was really frustrated that, because it's central government is didn't any respond to historians voices. So yeah, so I'm curious about your experience.
Okay, so historians were able to get some revision of standards, and of course, I mean, this is only at the high school level. I mean, nobody imposes any standards or anything. Nobody imposes any standards on the university faculty. And that's clearly to the good. But so otherwise, I think people were really frustrated. But it's cases like the Latino textbook where issues come to the fore, where things, and if there's enough of an outcry, the school board will be somewhat more hesitant, right? A number of people who read these textbooks made real pitches for people to run for school board as a way to influence these kinds of decisions. But I don't know what well, I'm sure it's worse to have a central government imposing a textbook. On the other hand, uninformed religious zealots make very bad choices as well.
It's funny, in Arlington, you have 2 minutes to talk to this group.
You could, for a historian,
public
that's
opinion.
really
We're going to consult the public,
Like, yeah, right.
2 minutes each. Town council meetings to send.
Wow.
Can't even get a 3-minute thesis in on that.
Yeah.
Our shortest little spurts are still too long.
Elevator pitch.
All right, so off we go. And there's a reception outside, as you all know, to which all are welcome.
Here.